Everybody in this room is affected by the laws that our elected officials have put in place, and farmers and ranchers are no different. Farmers and ranchers make up only 2% of the world's population, so they really need Farm Bureau and other advocacy groups to help support them so that we can continue to feed America and the world. I look forward to discussing this issue with y'all.
With less than 5% of our current policy leaders having roots in agriculture, it is imperative now more than ever that we educate them on the agricultural issues that we are facing. And I think through farm tours and implementing educational strategies for the policy leaders is a great way to start helping with the success. Thank you.
In a conversation with Brandon Barnett, an ag science analyst for the Foreign Ag Service and a former colleague from the International Fresh Produce Association, he reflected on a conversation with a lobbyist from the organization. At the topic at hand, the lobbyist asked the policymaker, "What would we do without these resources for farmers? How would we get our food?" The policymaker responded, "We would get it from the grocery store." The job of educating policymakers will be a job that is never finished.
Routine and active participation at the state, local, and national level are vital to maintaining favorable policies that benefit the next and current generations of America's families, farmers, and ranchers.
Farmers and politicians are extremely busy people, with policy updates continuing to be relevant, issues in agriculture that are more prevalent now than ever. We need our help. We need Farm Bureau's help, and we need to be able to help politicians and agriculturalists so that we can communicate these issues to build a better future for tomorrow.
With each generation being further removed from the farm, there is a lack of knowledge in our general public, including with our elected officials, about the agriculture industry. It is important that our elected officials know about agriculture, for they make the policies and laws that we have to follow. I believe that we can educate our policymakers by inviting them to our farms and giving them tours, and also being a great advocate for our industry. I look forward to discussing this topic with y'all.
You have heard the opening statements. The competitors may now proceed with the discussion. Competitors, please direct your discussion to your fellow panel members.
So I think something that we really need to address first and foremost is these issues that we are seeing. The disconnect between politicians and farmers or producers within the area. I forget who said it, I think you said there's 5% of our leaders are in agriculture, and that's a significant number when we come from a country that was based on farming to now being in a country where we think that food comes from the grocery store.
And one of the biggest things that was highlighted, we all reference education. I think education is going to serve as the vital piece when we talk about all this. I mean, Layla, you even mentioned that in talks with your local policy representative, they mentioned that food would come from the grocery store. And so it shows that we have to represent agriculture every day, whether that be through youth farming shows, whether that's through inviting them to the farm. We have to share our successes and our failures to not understand that, hey, this is not just a job, this is people's way of life. And I think that is going to be one of the most vital tools when we talk about education, is sharing those personal stories and not even allowing it to understand that it's not unique to me, but we all have individual stories that will effectively change outcomes and also influence policy as well.
Miles, this is a really great point that you bring up about how the job of education is something we'll continually have to do.
Yeah.
As we know, all of our elected representatives beyond the Supreme Court have term limits, so we're going to constantly be dealing with the overturn of elected officials and constantly having to re-educate newly elected officials. Additionally, I do feel that we have to find a way, and I mean, Farm Bureau is no stranger to understanding the challenge that we face when we're talking about educating elected officials regarding agriculture. During my summer internship experience on the government relations team with the International Fresh Produce Association, I helped to work on developing quick fact sheets about specialty crop economics within each state, and this would kind of serve as like a quick reference for politicians to sort of get a snapshot of what agriculture is looking like in their state in relation to specialty crops. And I think that Farm Bureau could implement a similar program so that we could quickly disseminate some of these researches.
And even with Farm Bureau, Jonah, you mentioned earlier, you mentioned that 2% and that 98%. 2% of people are involved in agriculture. And I think what you highlight, that it even shows that even amongst us, not just with our political leaders, we have to make sure that we understand each other's story. That way when we get in rooms where we talk to our political advocates, we fully understand not just my story, but also, can I share the story of my neighbor? Can I share the story of somebody from my community, from my county? Just understand that we all are having a shared cooperation in sustaining and supporting this livelihood.
So I agree that knowledge is a very important tool, and a lot of our elected officials lack the knowledge of agriculture. And one example that I like to highlight is Proposition 12 being passed in California. Like, that clearly came from someone who hasn't spoke to a farmer, because animals in confinement, it's for their safety. Like sows in a farrowing crate, it's so she doesn't crush the piglets, and for the animals' safety as well as the humans. So I think it's important that we find ways to connect our officials, have them visit the farms and realize why we do these practices. And so they understand why agriculture has these practices, instead of making laws and listening to just the big voices outside of agriculture. I think they really need to visit the farms and come talk to the actual farmers about agriculture and the laws that they're making.
And with you highlighting that, it's also important to understand that we have to make sure when we're aligning these policies and we're educating people on them, that it properly aligns with even the farmer schedule as well. So, politicians and also farmers, you got to make sure it's not happening during the growing season. You want to come and engage with my farm. I also have things that I'm currently involved in. And so going back to how you were mentioning policies, we can even talk about the recent Inflation Reduction Act. We can talk about how within that Inflation Reduction Act, they had a lot of bills that was favored towards cover crops nationwide, right? During my recent internship experience with the United States Department of Agriculture, Natural Resource Conservation Service, I had the opportunity to spend time in Nevada to understand how some of these cover crop policies will be implemented in the areas that are water scarce regions, right? And so it's important that we continually, routinely engage, and like you were saying, bringing us out to the farm is going to help, but we have to make sure it aligns not only with the politician's schedule, but with the farmer's schedule as well.
And
I think it's always good important in how we
and
can
while we're
develop.
talking about policy, the Farm Bureau actually has a briefing booklet. And now while the briefing booklet, it goes over policies and things that are being touched on in legislation. And all of those factors are very important. But this policy briefing booklet is 12 pages long. And politicians are very busy people, as we're figuring out, as we're discussing. And a 12-page booklet briefing policies that these legislators are seeing within the agriculture industry, I think we as Farm Bureau need to be able to represent ourselves and go to these politicians and have a voice to be able to summarize these points, because it comes a lot stronger of a point across if we're able to be there ourselves, not just give them the piece of paper and say, hey, read this thing, you know? So if we're able to go and be the voice of agriculture that we as Farm Bureau are, we'll be able to have the face to a name, have a face to an organization, and saying, hey, these are the important parts that we really think that you need to hone in on.
I really think
Miles,
that's a
I
great
really
point. I
think
think
it's a
that we
great
have to
idea.
focus in on developing champion politicians who can have those connections with farmers and build them on a daily basis. And I also came across that same briefing in my research. And I think the issue with this briefing and our goal of educating policymakers is that briefing is geared more towards our Farm Bureau members to educate them about what policy is going on. But we have to focus on our specific target audience, which is those policymakers, people who have that legal background, change the attitude of what we're talking about, and we need to sort of reverse the goal of education in those briefings. That briefing is meant to talk to farmers and our members about what legal issues are up for debate, but we need to have something that tells the legislators what farming issues are up to debate, what issues are farming facing on a daily basis. And I really am interested to see what you guys think about what types of events could Farm Bureau hold, or sort of networking things. You know, a lot of commodity groups, they hold like policy days where people can come, they invite farmers that are part of those commodity groups to network with politicians and start building those connections so that we can have those sort of champions that bring a face to the issues that these politicians are seeing.
And you highlighted, it's almost like we're speaking about, when we talk, we're speaking about relationships, right? And relationship building, it takes time. It takes time to be able to routinely engage with people and understand and also build trust and cooperation. And one of the solutions that I think definitely exists is during our national conferences, whenever we have our summits, we have to invite local representatives to be involved in the conversations. Hey, these are people too, you know, outside of just the policy. We got to understand that the policy that we're creating is shaping our lives, and it's so important to understand that there are people behind those policies.
I think additionally,
I
we
really
really
like
need to
what you
focus
said earlier about how we should bring elected officials to our farms. That was actually one of the points I had written down before we even came up here. So I'm glad to see we're kind of on the same track here. Miles, you mentioned it. Allison, you mentioned it as well. And you mentioned the 12-page booklet of all this kind of stuff. What better way than to get our points across than to show them that booklet? What better ways than to show them these are the issues on a farm. These are what we're facing, and how we can get that point across to each other. And it also makes the politicians more accountable. You know, if you're making a decision for a huge group of people, and you know you're going to have to go talk to that group of people about why you made this decision. And I know for me personally, that would make me think twice about, hey, do I really believe in this? And make me, think a little more and say, hey, is this really the right thing to do. And I'm glad you said you wanted to hear all of our voices. That was
And
that
I
was
think
really
an
great.
invitation
I really
is a
like that point
great
that you
way
bring up about
to-
how we need to develop those relationships and really focus on putting a face to those stories so that politicians are held accountable. And additionally, I think we need to urge our focus towards urban legislators, because oftentimes they don't feel that they have a hand in agriculture, and they are just as much as affected as those farmers, because we are all a part of our food system. And I think it's also careful that we structure our conversations carefully, thinking about the word selection we're using. Maybe turn away from using the word agriculture because we want to avoid those preconceived notions from people who aren't so involved in the industry. Maybe start framing the conversation around food systems instead, because when we hear about food systems, everyone's thinking about what's coming to their plate. So we really need to be focused on building those relationships and bridging that connection and the gap between those more urban areas and the agriculture production, and specifically focusing on those legislators, because everyone deserves a seat at the table when we are discussing the security of our food and the security of our farmers.
And
Well,
I
I
think
think
that's
in
something
the
really great
envi-
about that is I'm a community food systems major in urban horticulture, and what I strive to do is bringing these food systems into the communities, because I'm from Cary and Raleigh, so I don't really get to go out to these farms, and until I joined FFA in high school, I really had no idea, I've been removed from the farm so many in my generation. So I think that that's a great point that you brought up, and that's what the work that I'm trying to do is I do hydroponics and aquaponics systems and build vertical growing systems to implement into our Raleigh food line. So I think that it's really important, as you said, to educate the people, because a lot of people from where I'm from, they don't know where their food is coming from. And I feel like a lot of policymakers, like I said, less than 5% of them actually have roots. So they're making these policies on paper, but they're not seeing how they work in practice. And I think that it's really important that we highlight that. And also, as you pointed out, I love the going to the farms and taking the tours. But as you said, officials, they have a time lapse. Like, they're not, so we have to make sure that we put something in place that is actually going to continue on for years and years to come. Because taking one group of officials 5 years ago, our ag scene was a lot different than it is today. After COVID, a lot of things have changed. After just the economy, the way the world is going on, the wars that have happened. So I think it's just really important that we make that timeline, because it's not just a one-time solution. It's a we have to do this for a lot of years.
And
to
See,
come.
and
I
what you
agree
shared
that
is the
an
fact that
invitation to
during
a-
sharing, we have to
like a
often
farm
even
bureau
look at how policies will even have to be reflected, right? So two things that you highlighted, right? The first thing is that it looks like we have a way to unite our food systems. We have bringing out to the farm. That's going to be a rural area. You talk about hydroponic grow systems. That's going to be in more of an urban environment. We can even unite legislators within Congress or within our local areas to understand that how both of these policies reflect. The other thing, like you were saying that a lot of times we've seen how we network changes. I mean, our stories have to show that. We have to use a variety of mediums, whether that's social media, whether that's YouTube, whether that's Netflix, and share those stories through multiple mediums so that way we're able to reach the most of people. Because maybe my time might not be able to have you out on my farm in the height of my growing season, but maybe I can share this video with you that you can share with your staffers and your aides, and we can keep the process going that way. It's a continual thing, and the more that we push out content, the more that you'll be able to see feed from what I'm experiencing on my farm. Like most recently in Georgia, we had a late frost, and a lot of the farmers actually lost a lot of their fruit production. And one of the big things that we did, we shared the videos of what that looks like on the farm. We invited legislators to understand how those disaster relief programs in the state are needed to help supplement and support our agriculture programs.
Miles,
Well,
I'm so
and I
glad
think
that you brought
that
that
inviting
up about
elected officials
having
to not
videos as
only
a
our
way to
farms,
show them.
but also
And Nika
county.
Grace, earlier you brought up the education of the people, and I think that's something that's really important when we're talking about legislators, because at the end of the day, they serve us as constituents. So if constituents are educated, they'll be able to apply that pressure on politicians to continue to focus on these ag issues and to take them as a priority. And I believe that videos and publications of that form that are accessible to everyone at any time, well, somewhat anyone, we can't, we'd be remiss not to acknowledge the fact that still a lot of farmers specifically don't have access to broadband internet, but our legislators
Very
should.
true, very true.
So I think that's a really great point that you brought up, and then especially about the accessibility of videos, Miles.
And
Yeah,
Farm
like-
Well,
Bureau
and I
has been
believe
really
that if we invite our elected officials not only to our farms, but also there's county farm bureau meetings, YF&R meetings, and we have local, state, and federal officials to think about on all three levels. So there's no reason that we can't invite at least a local or a state or a federal official to each of our county farm bureau meetings. And so they get to see the process of what our farmers are talking about during these days. Invite them to the YF&R conferences in the wintertime. I
That
mean,
made
that's
me
a great
reflect on-
way
Mhm.
to just get them involved in not only agriculture but also in Farm Bureau to get that connection between the farmers. Because I
And
think
there's-
when they place a face to a name, it's always better. Danielle? what
And
were you
there's
saying?
actually in Idaho, the state of Idaho, they're putting this in action. The board members are challenging the Farm Bureau members to actually invite these officials to their meetings, to their organizations and programming events, so that they're able to show these officials. And I don't know if you guys knew this, but officials actually 85% of their time, or 40 hours a week, is devoted to being within their community, to writing legislation. So only realistically 145 to 180 days are spent in legislative days in the office in the Capitol. So we can take full advantage of the time that they have. Allison and I had a meeting with State Representative Jimmy Dixon the other week, and it was just fantastic that he was able to meet with us during his busyness. He had a meeting to go to after he spoke with us, but we learned so much from him. We learned about how he wishes he would be invited to more events. He's an agriculturalist at heart, and he loves every single part of that. And if we as Farm Bureau can invite these officials, if we can encourage our county boards to invite officials to these programs, it would be super beneficial.
You know,
So we
Danielle,
can
you
already
bring up
say
a
that
really
the
good point
solutions-
about that. Within North Carolina Farm Bureau, actually, I attended an event, and you also maybe reflect on this when you're talking about that community engagement portion. Farm Bureau puts on an event, at least Wake County Farm Bureau, called Farm City Day, where those legislators and also Farm Bureau members, farmers, can come and network with high school FFA members. Now, of course, this is something that's geared more towards the youth, but I think that we could implement something similar as far as meeting constituents and legislators. Because like you said, a great portion of their time is taken up with networking and talking to those constituents, and kind of just making sure they show face in their community. And I think that if we foster this in sort of a casual environment, it could take some of that pressure off of the shoulders of both the politicians and the farmers when it comes to advocacy. And they can make it sort of a more formal conversation. And I think something really special about Farm City Day specifically is they're having these conversations over a shared meal. And I think the power of having that shared meal could be something to kind of bring that unity and bring the comfort, the personability that's needed to be able to bring those conversations towards politicians and have that comfortability.
Yeah,
So
I
we
So
can
we
say the
talked a
solutions
lot about
already
inviting
exist.
politicians
We
to
see
the
most of
farm,
these things
but I
become more
think
and more
another way we
highlighted when
can
we
turn
talk
around.
about being able to talk about like how we can even show the solutions exist. Farm Bureau offers those solutions. Now it's going to be on us putting us forward, but also showing how it's going to have to be creative within different environments. What may work for North Carolina Farm Bureau may not work for Tennessee
have to
or
tailor
Georgia
it,
Farm
for
Bureau. We
sure.
have to tailor the programs. Like we were saying, Farm Day was something that our high school FFA chapter routinely did. We invited the mayor to our city out, just local people that will understand the impact that we can have on our food system. So the solutions already exist, and I think that each of us offer a very unique approach to figure out not only how we can share those stories, but how we can also network amongst each other and make sure that we understand our own personal stories as
And
well.
like how you mentioned, share your story. And so we talked about a lot about inviting officials to our farms and our meetings. But I think we need to talk about a big part of what Farm Bureau is, learning how to be an advocate for ourselves and for our industry. And Farm Bureau's website has a great many resources of how to talk to an official and how to become an advocate and become that leader. Because I believe that you can't just invite them all the time. You've got to show some initiative, because when you take that time to pick up the phone and give them a call, or if you take the time to go to your local board meeting or Raleigh or even Washington, D.C., it shows a lot of that you care about the issues and that it's important enough to get you off of your farm and to their office. And if they can connect a story and a face to a situation, it makes them that much more likely to support a law, because they actually see who it's affecting and they hear that they're affecting. And I know, Jonah, you were trying to say something earlier.
Yeah,
so
thank
that's
you.
what I said.
Layla, I thought you brought up a great point earlier when you talked about public perception. I thought that was great, because public perception is everything in politics. We need to make sure agriculture is shown in the best light. You mentioned how to maybe not stop, or maybe not use the word agriculture, maybe change that to food system. I think that would have a great impact, and Neva Grace into the food systems major, and that being more of a city-focused thing. You were saying these politicians are busy. Having those food systems in these urban areas is such a great opportunity that I do not think we as Farm Bureau and YFNR have fully explored yet, and I think that provides just a huge opportunity to get our name out there and show what we can really do in the sustainability field.
You know,
Neva Grace,
Jonah?
do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think it's, as you pointed out, I am a sustainability major, and I think it is very important that we educate people about where their food comes from. And Layla, you were talking about Farm City Days, and I had the pleasure of doing that, and it was a really great experience. And I think you brought up a good point about educating people, but we need to talk about educating youth. So if we start them young, we teach these young policymakers, and then they move on, and they have those stories that they've heard. So opportunities like Farm City Days or just FFA in general. I was happy to be an FFA all 4 years, and I served on our team for 3. So I was really able to meet a lot of people, make those connections, and try to educate these people on, like, this is where your food comes from. And I just love that we're talking about sustainable food systems, because I'm very passionate about teaching people where their food comes from, because I'm not a traditional farmer. Like, you're not going to see me on a tractor. Like, that's not who I am. But, like, if I can tell someone how this would grow hydroponically, I would love to do that, because it's the same kind of process. It's just a little bit different of a way to do it, and it's a little more.
Neva Grace, I really love that you brought up that point, because I share that same passion about educating, which is part of why I chose to study ag education and move into that field, because I do think it's an extremely powerful tool, and especially you were talking about earlier, advocacy training is going to be huge, and things like teaching people how to use the right wording and thinking about perception all the time. It's sort of a marketing skill in a way that we really need to make sure we're equipping our farmers with, so that they feel comfortable to talk to these politicians, and additionally making sure that they remember that our politicians, our lawmakers are here to serve us. You should not feel uncomfortable to go up to their office, to make an appointment, to call those representatives and speak with them directly. And I think that providing advocacy training, even just beyond the website, like possibly we could have workshops or things like that where we could teach both farmers and youth. You know, I think we can also start pushing for policy to make ag education a standard across, high school, public school curriculums at least. I think not only would that provide numerous benefits as far as just us understanding our food system and preparing the future with job skills, but additionally, people who go into the policy arena or related industries to agriculture, they'll already be equipped with that background knowledge, and it won't be something that's so taboo to talk about now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
and I
was saying
agree
that. I think
that
one of the
educating
said
the
a
youth
great
is
thing
very
about
important.
the
But I
ag in
think
the
that
classroom. I
politicians
think
is the
that's
focus
so
of this
great.
conversation. And so, I wanted to talk about, the politicians that are in office now, but I know one of y'all mentioned earlier that it starts before they're in office, electing the right officials into office. And one way that Virginia Farm Bureau helps them is actually at our wife and our summer conference one year. It was during the governor election, and we invited both of the governor candidates out to the location of the meeting, and we had them up there kind of at a debate, and we asked them questions relating to agriculture and what their stance were on agriculture. And so I think it's really important to build that rapport with them before they become an elected official and know where they stand on agriculture and what they might do to help agriculture. And I think that's really important, because electing the right officials will build that connection, and someone that's for agriculture is always better, who will understand our position. Daniel, did you have anything
Now,
to add?
adding to all of this, what everybody's saying about the advocacy and telling our story is vital. And I think we also have to remember that Farm Bureau has grassroots programs that are already in place, teaching how to be an advocate for yourself, going to social gatherings and doing Capitol Roundup, just informing farmers. And I think we need to take that from the national and the state level down to the county level, and actually, like what you were saying, Layla, implementing it, being able to create these workshops and these outreach programs. So it's not just on a website, but so it's being acted out, so that these farmers and these producers are seeing how to be an advocate in
I
real time
wholeheartedly
as a
agree,
person.
Danielle.
And one thing I
that's
want
a
to say is
great
I
point you
understand
brought
that
up.
we can't do it all. You know what I'm saying? We can't be the educators. We can't be the advocates. But one thing that I really highlighted is Neva and Jonah, thank you, because I understand, look, we all just display our passion in a variety of ways, so I really appreciate y'all sharing y'all viewpoint. And one of the things that I really brought together with both of y'all saying that is how in your opening statement, it really brings us back to what you talked about. We can bring that 98% over to that 2%, right? Maybe we won't be actively involved in farming, but we can understand it. With Layla, you brought up education, and you also understanding that, how we educate also matters too. And like you were saying, the programs already exist. We see that Farm Bureau is a grassroots organization. That's what its basis is. And even with the discussion right here, we're propelling ourselves to be able to understand the intricacies of these policies, how to shape ourselves, and also make sure that we're better advocates for everyone involved in agriculture, whether you're in an urban or suburban or rural environment. I really enjoyed how we're discussing and bringing these solutions to the table.
Yeah, I think what you said was great. You talked about we don't have time to do everything. That's so true. But I think if we all sit and think, what is the best way to get people to understand agriculture and politics, I think it's to start at the grassroots of it, so to speak, and get farmers and ranchers elected into politics. All of a sudden you have solved your education problem. You don't need to educate these people. They know, and now they can go educate their peers. I think that is a solution that we should hammer home, and I think Farm Bureau does a great job of with programs like EIFEL and Ag in the Classroom and the LEAD program. They do so much good work with these programs and getting people into ag, getting people into leadership, getting people into elected office. I think that's so great. And like you said, the programs are out there. They are out there. We just have to be able to use them correctly and to the best of their ability.
And I think the
Jonah, I'm
solution that we
glad you
really
brought
came
that
up with is connection. Connection is the key to everything in this solution. Connecting to our elected officials and connecting to our youth to inform them about agriculture, because agriculture does affect everyone. You feed everyone, so everyone does need to know about agriculture and have an understanding of that. Not just our elected officials, but everyone in general. But elected officials, if we connect with them and we build these relationships, that is really where we're going to see the most impact at.
And that goes right back into what I was discussing earlier about developing those champion politicians, especially when you're talking about it starts with before they're elected into office. And the same thing with you, what you just spoke on, Jonah, about getting those farmers in that
Right.
position. We really have to work along Farm Bureau, along our members, along with commodity groups, to develop those people who really have that passion and get them into places of influence where they can actually make an impact legally on our community, not just through these stories, but we know that policy has power. That's why this entire organization even exists.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So-
I completely agree. I think this discussion has shown there's lots of people with passion in agriculture.
Definitely.
I think that is very evident. And I want to go back to the last part of the question that says, how can we use public policy to support the financial viability of family farms? That's why the policy exists. I think we really need to hammer home and say, make sure that the topics at the forefront of the discussion are the topics that make family farms the most profitable, because it is getting more and more difficult to own and operate and successfully run a family farm. Neva Grace, do you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, I was about to say, that's a great point, especially in North Carolina. I'm trying to remember the statistics. I believe it's 1 in 6 people are employed in farming or some sort of farming in North Carolina
We're the seventh
alone.
largest ag industry in
We're
the
the
country.
seventh largest ag industry, so we're no stranger to ag, and ag is what fuels our economy. I believe it's more than 100, I'm trying to remember the numbers, but it puts so much into our economy that if we let all our family farms go, who knows what's going to happen to us, 1, for our food, and 2, for just our communities as we know them. So I think it's really important that, as we've talked about, the education of the people and letting everyone know where their food comes from. And I know something that Farm Bureau does that's really great is they have, I can't remember the name of it, but it's a video that they put out once a week and in a newsletter that they put out, and it talks about what happened on Capitol Hill this week and what legislation, the Capitol Rundown. So it tells people, these farmers, like, hey, this is what's happening, this is how it's affecting you. And I think that's something great the Farm Bureau does, because if the farmers don't know what's happening in legislation.
Time has been called. Please prepare your 1-minute closing statements. I ask that the audience remain silent for 1 minute to aid the competitors in their preparation. Please put down your pencils. In voluntary order, stand and give your 1-minute closing statement.
As we've discussed today, politicians and farmers are very busy people. We need to be able to communicate everything that is going on within the farming industry and within policy. Legislators need to become aware of policy updates. We as Farm Bureau members should be able to go to these organizations, legislation within the community, and express these updates and these challenges that we are facing. We discussed today some solutions revolving advocacy and building relationships with politicians. We also discussed farm tours, both in person and virtual, as there is a constant overlap of politicians in office. And if we're able to do all of these things, we as Farm Bureau can ensure that we have a stable future. We can ensure that the food system is continuing to provide for a growing population.
Today we engaged in an extremely lively discussion that showcased all of our passions regarding connecting policymakers to agriculture. I think we all understand as members of Farm Bureau that policy is really impactful when it comes to our food systems. Although we already have the resources, the knowledge in place through Farm Bureau, we really need to focus in and strategize just exactly what can we put all of our energy, our funds into currently to make the most efficient connections to policymakers in agriculture. We really need to focus in involving and providing a seat at the table with urban lawmakers in relations to our food systems. Additionally, we need to leverage our connections to youth through organizations such as FFA, Manners, Young Farmers and Ranchers, to make sure that we are preparing a next generation of policymakers and possibly convincing farmers to become more involved in policymaking. Now we're aware that they might not have the time to do both growing food and become a lawmaker. However, we might be able to foster the transition and prepare them so that if they choose to retire from farming and they choose to choose a career in policy, that they're well prepared.
As we discussed, less than 5% of our elected officials come from an agricultural background. And the elected officials on the local, state, and federal levels are the ones making our policies and laws that we need to follow. And I think this is even more a reason why we need them to be educated about agriculture. Today we discussed many solutions, including using social media and videos to get to our policymakers and the general public. We talked about sharing a meal with our policymakers because that's always a great way to connect with someone. We also talked about inviting the policymakers out to our farms while also being a successful advocate ourselves. I believe that these solutions, with Farm Bureau's help, can make a huge impact on our agriculture industry in the future.
I believe we hit on a lot of great topics today, and there's no doubt that we all have passion in this room for agriculture. From farm tours and actually getting the policymakers out onto the fields to introducing urbanites, to the 2% that actually put food on their plate, those are all great solutions to trying to make sure that the policymakers have the accurate knowledge in order to make these decisions on paper and know how they affect people in practice. I think that Farm Bureau already has a lot of great things in place, but I think we need to work on emphasizing them and changing them as times arise. As we talked about social media. Social media was not a big thing 20 years ago, but it's something that we all need to start embracing because I feel like that is a great way to start engaging the younger community and the new community that like to farm.
Neighbor Grace took the words right out of my mouth with the passion. I think it's great, a bunch of young people getting up here and sharing their passions for agriculture. I really like what we said about getting politicians to the farm. I think that's a great program, and Farm Bureau already does so much with their younger people programs with Ag in the Classroom and the YFNR programs and the Eiffel programs. I think it's great, and I think the best way that we can tell politicians about agriculture is to have agriculturalists in politics. And I'm so glad we got to have this discussion.
You know what I'm saying? I share that, Joan. I fully enjoy the discussion that we had today. It is very important that we understand with 2% of people being involved in agriculture, it'll be important for us to work tirelessly to implement those solutions that are required to carry forward for the next generation. We also have to understand that a variety of solutions exist today, and we've all discussed it. Let's make sure that we always are sharing those unique approaches to resolving our agricultural issue.
Let's show these competitors our appreciation for a job well done.